Pilgrim's Progress, which this panorama illustrates, is a Christian allegory that was written in 1678 by the reformist preacher John Bunyan. And the story begins with John Bunyan himself. He tells the entire story of the Pilgrim's Progress, the story of a man named Christian on his way to the celestial city, as though it is a dream that he had. John Bunyan wrote the Pilgrim's Progress while he was imprisoned for preaching heresy, and the dream that he had while he was in prison. So the whole story begins this way, and indeed the first scene of the panorama shows us John Bunyan in his prison cell. You can see his papers and his ink bottle in front of him here on the table, suggesting the writing work that he was doing while he was there. There's also another important message in this first scene of the panorama, and it's a current that runs through the entire story of the Pilgrim's Progress. The lovely young lady who's here with John Bunyan is his daughter, Mary, who was born blind, and she was born just as John Bunyan was being put into prison for heresy. So just as this very needful child, this huge family obligation, takes hold of him, he's also having to make this choice about whether he will go ahead and preach the gospel as he knows it and risk being thrown into prison, or stay with his family. Right away, as we begin the Pilgrim's Progress, we're faced with this choice between doing what you know to be right in the abstract and doing what's right for your family. It's something that Bunyan certainly struggled with, and it's something that, as we'll see, his protagonist Christian struggles with as well. Bunyan's opening words of the Pilgrim's Progress describe its dream format. He talks about how he was wandering in the wilderness of the world where he found a den, laid down to go to sleep, and as he slept, he dreamed a dream. So here we see Bunyan in this den of which he writes, sleeping and dreaming, and over on this side is the beginning of the dream that he had. He describes how he sees a man standing in a field holding a book in his hands. The man's name is Christian, and the book represents the Bible, although we're never specifically told that in the text of the Pilgrim's Progress. As Christian reads this book, he comes to understand that the city that he lives in, the city of destruction, which you see over here with its sort of Eastern-looking minarets and sphinxes and pyramid shapes, is going to be burned with a fire from heaven, as is he, as is his family, which you can see here standing in front of their charming little white cottage. So Christian realizes as he reads this book that he's got to get out of here. That's the only way that he has to save himself. So he's got to get out of the city of destruction and start on a journey to the celestial city. He tries to convince his wife and sons to come with him, but they don't want to. They feel like it's too risky. But he decides to leave anyway. They run after him, calling to him, begging him to return, and he literally puts his fingers in his ears and runs away, saying, life, life, eternal life. So once again, this is the same struggle that John Bunyan had at the beginning of his own story, that decision about whether to stay with your family or to do what you know you need to do in order to be saved. That's the central moral dilemma of the Pilgrim's Progress. So as Christian begins on his journey, the first person that he encounters is a man named Evangelist, who you see here. Evangelist points out to Christian that there is a path that he needs to follow in order to get to the celestial city. And throughout the Pilgrim's Progress, the path is referred to as the King's Highway or the narrow path. And Evangelist is the one who tells Christian the utmost importance of staying on that path. Staying on that path is the most important thing throughout the entire story, and here's where that all gets set up. Evangelist also gives Christian a scroll, which you can see in his hand there, and the scroll includes instructions for Christian that he will consult throughout his journey. Evangelist is pointing to what we know as the wicket gate, and you can see that sort of shining in the darkness a little beyond over there. The wicket gate, and it's called a wicket because it's curved like a wicket in the game of croquet. It is the first official gate post on that narrow path. So Christian has to pass through the wicket gate before he has officially begun on his journey. So Christian sees the gate and he starts heading towards it. But unfortunately, there is trouble in store for Christian. He has not gone very far at all before he finds himself stuck in a swamp. He can hardly lift his feet because this swamp is so thick and sludgy. Now this swamp is a great example of something that recurs throughout the Pilgrim's Progress, which is that people and places have names that give you clues about what they're all about. This swamp is called the Slough of Despond, and so it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a pit of despair. This is where you get stuck because you lose heart. And so it's a really useful metaphor for Christian ideals, but also universal themes. Everybody has a moment in their life where they get stuck and they don't know how to continue. This swamp is really artfully depicted by the artists of the Panorama. You can see this snake twining around this dead tree, the owl watching over everything. These are really powerful symbols of death and deceit. So Christian is stuck here and he's floundering around trying to figure out a way to get out. He is with a neighbor named Pliable, who says, "I've had it with this, I'm out of here." He turns around, he heads back to the city of destruction because he is not interested in whatever lays in store for them beyond this swamp. But Christian struggles through to the other side, where he finds a man named Help, who reaches down to literally help him out. So that's another great example of the names of the characters that refer to their role in the story. Help explains to him that if he had just calmed down, he would have realized that there's actually a stairway that leads out of the Slough of Despond. So the message there is sort of keep your wits about you, look for a way out, but it's also okay if you need a little help. One of the reasons that Christian has so much difficulty in the Slough of Despond is that he has this enormous heavy pack upon his back, which you can see here. That represents his burden of earthly sins, and it's something that he has to carry throughout the whole first part of his journey. It's very cumbersome, as you might imagine. So once he gets out of the Slough of Despond and continues along the narrow path, he meets a man named Mr. Legality, who you see here. Mr. Legality observes that Christian has this heavy pack upon his back, and he says to him, "You know, you don't need to be carrying that around. If you just leave the path and come over to my town, there's a guy there who, for a very reasonable price, will remove your burden of earthly sin so that you don't have to carry it around with you anymore." Well, poor Christian, this sounds like it's a pretty good deal to him. So he leaves the path and he tries to find this guy, but there's no town, there's no guy, nobody's there to help him. He finds himself in this storm of brimstone and fire, and it's all very terrifying. He does not know what to do. He does not know how to get back to the path. Thank goodness his friend Evangelist comes to find him again in this lonesome place, and he reminds him that his mission is to stay on that path, to keep looking at the scroll for instructions, and to get back to what's important. Evangelist's pose here is very reminiscent of that of Plato in the very famous fresco by Raphael, the School of Athens, in the Vatican. So the evangelist here is the voice of reason. He's the guy with the answers, and he is reminding us that the whole point is to stay on that path and keep your eyes on the prize. So after these struggles, Christian finally makes his way to the Wicket Gate, which again is that first official gatepost on the King's Highway on the narrow path. He knocks on the gate, and a messenger named Goodwill, who you don't see here but you will see in the second part of the Panorama, the Pilgrim's Progress, lets him through the gate. This is the moment when Christian fully addresses himself to his journey. This is the moment where he, through Bunyan's metaphor, commits himself to leading a Christian life. Once he gets through the gate, Goodwill introduces him to a man named the Interpreter, and together Christian and the Interpreter, who you see here crossing this bridge, move along to the Interpreter's house. At the Interpreter's house, Christian sees a lot of different things that are going to be lessons for him on how to deal with the rest of his journey. The Interpreter's house has many different rooms, and in the book of the Pilgrim's Progress, many different kinds of stories and metaphors are told. The artists of the Panorama chose to exhibit just one of those rooms and one of those things that the Interpreter demonstrates to Christian. So this scene is read sort of as a metaphor. These things are not literally happening, but it's sort of a story that the Interpreter is telling Christian. He leads Christian to the door of a beautiful palace, and inside the palace, Christian can see all of these people who are clothed in gold and are singing in joy. So obviously, there's a desire to get inside that palace. Unfortunately, there are some obstacles in the way. There's a man sitting here who's taking names, and then there are also a bunch of armed men guiding the entrance to the palace. As Christian watches, a man goes up and gives his name to the registrar sitting there at the little table. He pulls his sword and shield, and he hacks his way through the armed men that are guarding the door to the palace. Once he is through, he is welcomed by the other people, given raiment of gold, and they sing beautiful hymns together. Now, this is a scene that's a little difficult for 21st century viewers to understand. It's a little difficult to conceive of why an act of violence should get you into this beautiful, wonderful place. But you have to look at it in the context of 17th century ideas about facing obstacles and getting from one point to the other. The overall story is that Christian's going to be on this journey, and he's going to face obstacles, and there are going to be people who try to stop him from reaching his goal. But he has to remain undeterred, and he has to not be dissuaded by anything that anyone says or does to him. If he is valiant, and if he remains determined, he will make it to the celestial city. And that's the story the interpreter tells him. So after Christian leaves the interpreter's house, he continues on his way, and soon he comes to this beautiful cross in a gorgeous mountaintop setting. As Christian approaches the cross, he falls to his knees. The burden of sin that he's been carrying this whole time falls from his back and falls into a sepulcher at his feet. These three angels approach him. They give him a change of clothing. They put a mark on his head. They give him another scroll with more instructions. And this is a wonderful transformative moment in the book of the Pilgrim's Progress as well as the Panorama itself. This is the moment that is analogous to the Christian concept of grace. It's the moment when Christian is saved, when he becomes a Christian, where there's that moment of direct connection with God. So it's a really important moment in the story. This scene is very much inspired by a painting by Frederick Edwin Church that was painted as a memorial to Thomas Cole, who is largely regarded as the father of American landscape painting. Many things are similar. That cross with the vegetation entwined around it, the mountaintop setting, those rolling, puffy clouds. And it really feeds into the idea that Thomas Cole was, in some ways, the beginning point that made something like this possible. The idea that Christian ideals and American landscape painting can go hand in hand. It's really a visual thing that's carried throughout the moving panorama of Pilgrim's Progress. After Christian's transformative experience at the cross, he begins to climb a hill that is called Difficulty. So again, another one of those meaningful place names. Even without the burden of sin on his back, climbing up this hill is indeed very difficult. So Christian becomes very tired. Halfway up the hill, he finds a very pleasant arbor where he decides to stop and rest. He is so tired that he falls asleep right there in the arbor, even though it's the middle of the daytime. He is ultimately awakened by this stern visitor who tells him, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise." And with this stern admonition, Christian leaps to his feet and continues running up and over the hill to get back to his journey as quickly as he can. But just as he gets onto the other side of the hill, he remembers, I forgot my scroll. It fell out of my hand while I was asleep. So he has to run all the way back to the arbor, get his scroll, and then retrace his steps again over the rest of the hill. And by this time, the sun has gone down and he's compelled to travel at night. In the darkness, Christian approaches the Palace Beautiful, which the interpreter had told him about. It is the place where he has been instructed to go and find shelter and receive further instruction. Christian is eager to get into the palace and to have some rest, but he is terrified to see these two fierce lions guarding the gate of the palace. You can see their eyes sort of gleaming in the darkness, and the moonlight that's picked up on Christian's shoulders and on the top of his head must have been a very effective illusion to historical audiences who were seeing this in a darkened theater lit by footlights. At any rate, Christian musters up his courage and prepares to pass the lions, and he discovers that as he passes between them on that narrow path, that they're chained, and they can only get so close to him because they are stopped by their chains. So this is another valuable lesson about the importance of staying on the path. If you trust in it and you're brave enough to continue on it, you will be protected. As Christian enters into the palace, he is welcomed by the four beautiful sisters who live there, whose names are Prudence, Piety, Charity, and Discretion. They get together and welcome him for the evening. They have a lovely evening and have a long theological discussion during which the sisters explain to Christian in a metaphorical form some of the basic tenets of Christian belief. Christian stays with the sisters for several days, and then before he leaves them, they advise him to visit the armory, where they suit him up in a whole new suit of armor. So this is Christian's kind of second costume change throughout the panorama of the Pilgrim's Progress. They warn him that he is going to face severe challenges after he leaves the Palace Beautiful, and that's why it's important for him to have protection in the form of armor. When Christian's ready to leave the Palace Beautiful, the sisters accompany him on his departure, and the first thing that they do is they take him to see a distant view of the Delectable Mountains. Now, this is one of the first of the times throughout the story of the Pilgrim's Progress and the Panorama where you get a distant view of the celestial city. There are different points in the journey where you can see across the path and across the landscape that you're in to your final goal, which is indeed that celestial city. This, we only get a sense of beautiful landscapes, and we don't see much of the city yet, but it's coming. So Christian and the sisters from the Palace Beautiful continued down the mountainside, because if you remember, this all happened on the top of the hill difficulty. As they continue down, Christian observes, it was difficult going up, but as far as I can see, it is dangerous going down. And one of the sisters replies to him, yes, that's true, for it is a difficult thing for a man to go down into the valley of humiliation. So this is where they are now, in the valley of humiliation, and this is where the sisters leave him. They give him some grapes and wine and some bread to sustain him for his journey, and again they warn him that dangerous challenges are coming his way. As Christian continues through the valley of humiliation, he's confronted by a foul fiend whose name is Apollyon, and as you can see, Apollyon is terrifying to behold. He has wings like a bat, scales like a lizard or a dragon, fangs like a lion, and claws like a bear. At first, Apollyon just questions Christian severely. He accuses him of trespassing on his land, and he accuses Christian of having all kinds of false beliefs. Christian's answers to Apollyon's questions are so clever and so intelligent and well thought out that Apollyon becomes enraged and begins to hurl flaming arrows at Christian. And this is the moment where it's a really good thing that Christian got that armor from the sisters at the Palace Beautiful. He deflects the arrows with his shield, and with his sword he gives Apollyon a swift, upright thrust. He doesn't kill Apollyon, but he deters him enough so that Apollyon howls with rage and flees away. And in fact, in the next scene, you'll see Apollyon flying away in the darkness. He is deterred enough from bothering Christian so that he's letting Christian continue on his journey, and instead he'll focus his energies on the next passengers who come along the path. So you can see here in the background of this scene, Apollyon, who's been defeated, fleeing away into the blackness. In the foreground here, you see poor Christian, who prevailed in the battle, but has been deeply wounded by Apollyon. So he's not sure how he can continue on his journey with these horrible wounds. Now, luckily, at this point in the story, and this is exactly as Bunyan describes it, a hand reaches out. And everybody asks if this is some sort of overpainting or mistake in the panorama, but in fact, this is exactly how it's described in the text of the Pilgrim's Progress itself. A disembodied hand with leaves from the tree of life reaches out to Christian. He takes the leaves, he applies them to his wounds, and magically he is healed, and he can then continue on his journey. Unfortunately, there is little rest for Christian, because having just completed this terrifying chapter with Apollyon, he now enters into the darkest, most dangerous, most terrifying part of his journey. This is the valley of the shadow of death, and he's got to go through it because the narrow path goes right through the middle of it. And as we all know, you've got to stay on that path. It is the only way. As Bunyan describes the valley of the shadow of death in the Pilgrim's Progress, the path is so narrow that you can barely put one foot in front of the other. On one side, there's a lake of fire. On the other side, there's a quagmire. that is filled with all of these souls howling, as Bunyan says, in unutterable agony. One of the things I think that's very effectively represented in this panorama scene is the noise and cacophony of the Valley of the Shadow of Death. People are whispering into Christian's ears. They're howling at him. They're screaming at him. It is so confusing to him that he can't figure out which way is forward and which way is back on the path. He is so terrified and overwhelmed that he is frozen in his spot. The thing that changes it for Christian is that suddenly he hears ahead of him on the path the voice of another pilgrim who started on the journey before him. And that pilgrim is saying the words of the 23rd Psalm. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. When Christian hears those words, two things happen. One is that suddenly he understands which way is forward on the path. By hearing that sound, he knows which way to go. And the other thing, of course, is that those timeless words give him hope to continue on his journey, which is exactly what he does. As he walks along, the dawn begins to break over the valley of the shadow of death, which is what's represented in this scene here. And this is the scene in the panorama that is designed by the famous Hudson River School painter Frederick Edwin Church. And if you know anything about Church's landscapes, you can see a real connection there with those blood-red sunsets and those craggy mountain faces. This is a very dark chapter in Christian's journey, and you can see that death has his wings spread over the valley still. And yet, there's this vague message of hope with the sun rising and the understanding that even the valley of the shadow of death has an end to it. As Christian leaves the valley of the shadow of death, he catches up with the man whose voice he had heard on the path ahead of him. That man's name is Faithful, and you see him and Christian here continuing along the path. As they leave the valley of the shadow of death, they pass a cave, and Faithful explains to Christian that once two giants dwelt in that cave, giants named Pope and Pagan. They have nothing to fear from these giants, Faithful explains, because Pagan died long ago, and Pope has become so old and creaky in his joints that he can do nothing more than sit in the mouth of the cave and bite his nails as he watches pilgrims go by, being frustrated that he can't get at them. This is definitely one of those chapters in the Pilgrim's Progress when we are aware that this is a reformist, a Protestant allegory, very much of its time. As Christian and Faithful continue on their journey, they approach a town whose name is Vanity. And in the town there is a fair called Vanity Fair. And indeed, this is the origin of that phrase, Vanity Fair. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress coined that term, which has come to mean a distraction that is enticing but potentially fatal. And in fact, that is exactly the conflict that Christian and Faithful face here in Vanity Fair. They walk through the fair because the narrow path passes through the middle of it, but they don't participate in what's going on. The people in the fair are gambling and cheating each other and doing all kinds of unchristian things, and Faithful and Christian remain separate from it. But unfortunately, because they don't participate, they become objects of suspicion in the fair. They are accused of having caused riotous conduct in the fair. They are imprisoned, they are taken to trial, and they are condemned to death. And indeed, in the Pilgrim's Progress, Faithful is executed, and he rises up to the celestial city at that moment. This is a part of the panorama where there are a few missing scenes. We know that the original panorama would have included some scenes from their imprisonment and their trial, and Faithful ascending up into heaven. Unfortunately, those scenes are lost or unlocated. At any rate, after Faithful is put to death, Christian escapes, and he escapes with another man who had been imprisoned named Hopeful. And as we continue their story, Christian and Hopeful travel on together to the celestial city. So for a while, Christian and Hopeful have relatively uneventful travels, and they start making some progress on their way to the celestial city. But one evening, they find a lovely meadow where they decide that they're going to spend the night. But they are awakened in the middle of their slumber by a giant named Despair, who accuses them of trespassing on his grounds. he takes them and he locks them up in his dungeon in the cellar of Doubting Castle. And that's where we are here in this scene, Doubting Castle. He keeps them imprisoned, and every day he comes down to beat them and berate them. And this goes on endlessly. Eventually, the giant Despair comes to visit them in their dungeon and tries to convince them to end their lives, since there's no way they'll escape and their existence is so miserable. Now you can see by Christian's body language here that he is ready to throw in the towel. He has had it, he has been through a lot on this journey, and he is ready to give up. But Hopeful, true to his name, convinces Christian to hold out a little while longer. He says to him, there's got to be a way out. We will figure this out. Don't despair. And luckily, as the story continues, suddenly Christian discovers that this whole time he has had a key in his pocket. The name of that key is Promise. And Christian and Hopeful are convinced that that key will open any door in the Doubting Castle so that they can escape. And that is indeed exactly what happens. And you see the pilgrims here with that key named Promise held up high, making their way out of the Doubting Castle with the giant Despair in rage and horror seeing them escape from his clutches. Finally, Christian and Hopeful have made it to the Delectable Mountains, that beautiful landscape that the Sisters of the Palace Beautiful had showed them sometime earlier in Christian's journey. At the top of the Delectable Mountains, they meet a group of shepherds, and the shepherds welcome them for the night, put them up in their tents, and give them advice about what will happen on the rest of their journey. This is a moment of rest for Christian and Hopeful in their journey, and it's also a moment of visual rest for the viewers of the Panorama. We've just gone through a lot of awfully traumatic scenes, and this scene is just a beautifully rendered figure group with lovely landscape behind it. It really shows the artistry of the Panorama artists. The shepherds, as we talked about before, give them a lot of advice and show them some useful things. They accompany them for a little ways additionally on their journey. One of the things that the shepherds show them is the Hill of Error. They bring them right to the edge of this cliff, and they encourage them to look down at the bottom of the cliff. And if you look carefully, you can see that there are bones and bodies strewn at the bottom of the cliff. The shepherds explain to Christian and Hopeful that what happened is that these men climbed too high on the Hill of Error and came too close to its brink and fell over the edge. So again, this is a really powerful reminder to stay on that path. You see exactly what happens to you when you don't. An interesting detail of this scene is that you actually see not just the bodies of people who fell from the hill in the past, but you actually see people in the act of falling from the Hill of Error. This is a very stark warning to remain focused on what your journey is all about. The shepherds also take the pilgrims to the top of a hill whose name is Clear, and from here they have a glorious view of the gates of the celestial city. Christian and Hopeful are thrilled to see it, but wish they could see it a little more clearly. So the shepherds say to them, why don't you try looking through our perspective glass? That's how Bunyan refers to it. Here in the Panorama, obviously, it is depicted as a sort of telescope, and it's a really interesting sort of play on the way in which the Panorama itself is a way of understanding this message, just as the pilgrims are trying to get a deeper understanding of it from looking through the telescope. They're excited to use that telescope, but their hands shake so much because they're so overwhelmed by what they're seeing that they still can't get a clear view. And so this is a really evocative part of Bunyan's message, is that you can get an understanding of what the celestial city is like. You can have a basic conception of what happens there and why you want to be there and why it's important to get there. But you can't see it. You can't understand fully what goes on there and what that's all about while you're still in this world. So this scene so effectively renders that, I think, for the viewers of the Panorama and for people who are familiar with that story of the Pilgrim's Progress. You get to see the pilgrims get all the way to the gates of the celestial city, but you never get to follow them inside. And so this message is conveyed here in this scene as well. After Christian and Hopeful leave the shepherds, they continue on until they find themselves in a dark lane. And here they are confronted with a man whom 7 devils have bound up in cords and are carrying away. This is a very frightening and threatening thing to see. And even though Christian and Hopeful aren't directly being threatened, you can tell by their defensive posture that this is something that's really frightening that's going on. It's very unnerving, and they're unsure of what's happening. Christian, too, thinks that he might recognize that man who's being carried away. He thinks that his name is Turnaway and that he dwelt in a town named Apostasy. And indeed, as the devils carry the man away, they can see that there's a sign on the man's back that says, "Damnable professor and wanton apostate." So if you know that word, apostate, you know that it means somebody who has turned away from faith, somebody who embraced the path and then left it. So just as Christian and Hopeful reach the end of their journey, this is a powerful reminder of how important it is to stay on that path and to stay focused. This is what happens to you if you don't. Soon they find themselves entering a lush forest, which is called the Enchanted Ground. Now the shepherds had told them about the enchanted ground and had warned them that this is a land that will make them sleepy. Hopeful wants to go to sleep, but Christian reminds him, no, the shepherds told us about this. It's very important to stay awake and to make our way through the enchanted ground. I think a really interesting detail in this scene is the vines that are twisted around this massive tree here in the foreground. To me, it's very reminiscent of that dead tree and the snake in the Slough of Despond. And indeed, these 2 different locations have a lot in common. These are both places where you can get bogged down, where you can get stuck, where your journey can come to a halt. And this is an evocative reminder that that's true of the enchanted ground. The message here is, this late in your journey, don't get jaded, don't get lazy, keep moving forward. And that's exactly what Christian and Hopeful do. As they leave the enchanted ground, they enter into the land of Beulah. And this gorgeous scene in the moving panorama of Pilgrim's Progress was designed by Jasper Cropsey, a student of Frederick Edwin Church's and a major figure in mid-19th century landscape painting. You can see that a lot of the motifs of landscape painting are used here, that framing foliage, the beautiful sunset in the background, those kind of celestial cloud-like visions. And indeed, Christian and Hopeful can see those gates of the celestial city, just as the viewers of the panorama could as well. They can see the steps that lead into the city, and they are welcomed by these angels in the land of Beulah, and they are just waiting for their message when it will be their turn to cross the river of death, which you can see here in the foreground of the land of Beulah, which is their last obstacle before they enter the celestial city. Ultimately, Christian and Hopeful enter the river of death, which is what's depicted here in this scene, the last scene from Christian's journey to the celestial city. As they wade into the river, they're afraid that the water is going to go over their heads. They're afraid they're going to lose their footing and drown, but they help each other cross the river. And that's very evident in this scene, which is very much inspired by Renaissance views of the baptism of Christ. You can see that on the other side of the river, just picked out in gold paint, there are 2 celestial messengers waiting to escort them to the celestial city. Now this is a difficult scene. What's happening here is that Christian and Hopeful are dying. That is the way to get to the celestial city. You have to cross that river of death. This is the end of their lives on this earth. And in that way, it is sad and dark. And you can see, again, those wings of the angel of death over this scene as a reminder that that's what's happening. But you know that once they get to the river, get across the river, and they're in the company of those angels, they'll be walking through those beautiful golden pearly gates where people are dressed in gold and singing praises for all of eternity. And that's their happy ending. We don't get to see Hopeful and Christian go into that celestial city, but we know from the story that that's what happens. And then don't forget that although this is the end of Christian's story, the panorama continues. And we're going to hear the story of Christian's wife, Christiana. And you'll see that when we get to the end of Christiana's story, there is a wonderful welcoming scene filled with angels and golden visions. So the viewers of the panorama do get that celestial reward as they sit through a performance of the panorama. second part of the moving panorama of Pilgrim's Progress reflects the second part of the Pilgrim's Progress itself. It was actually published in two parts. The first part, which we just saw, was published in 1678, this 6 years later in 1684. And it was a follow-up to part one of the Pilgrim's Progress, just to capitalize on the success of that original publication, but also to tell another part of the story. Part one of the Pilgrim's Progress tells the story of Christian, a man, on his journey from the city of destruction to the celestial city. Part two of the Pilgrim's Progress tells the story of Christian's wife, Christiana, and her family. So it adds another perspective onto that universal human struggle to get from the places of this world to the places of the next world. So part two of the Pilgrim's Progress picks up where the first part left off. Christiana still lives in the city of destruction with her 4 boys, who you can see here in this scene, and she is extremely bitter that her husband has left her and has gone off on this journey. As you remember at the beginning of part one, Christian runs off with his fingers in his ears, leaving them even as they call to him to return. So she's still angry about that, until a celestial messenger named Secret comes to visit her. They have a long discussion, and finally by the end of it, Christiana is persuaded that her husband Christian's adventure and journey has merit, and that she herself should go on the same journey and should take her 4 sons with her. And so begins the second part of the Pilgrim's Progress. So this is the very beginning of the journey of Christiana and her family out of the city of destruction. This is the moment when they're actually taking leave of the city of destruction. And on their way out of the city gates, they encounter 2 different neighbors. Mrs. Timorous, who is all the way over here on the left, who's wearing that sort of vaguely Eastern-looking headscarf, and Mercy, who you see here in the white dress. They have a conversation with both Mrs. Timorous and Mercy about what they're up to and the cause of their journey. Mrs. Timorous listens, but ultimately she decides that she was too afraid, true to her name, to join them on her journey, so she decides to stay in the city of destruction. And you can see Christiana sort of giving her a gesture of farewell. Mercy, on the other hand, decides that she does want to join them, and so from this point forward, she becomes part of their traveling crew. Now, one of the interesting things about part 2 of the Pilgrim's Progress, both the book and the panorama, is that the journey of Christiana and her traveling party takes a lot longer than Christian's. So they all grow older as they continue on. So as we move through the panorama, you'll see Mercy and Christiana's sons begin to grow older and turn into adults. And in the book, eventually Christiana marries one of the sons and they have their own family. So this little band of travelers keeps getting larger and larger as we move through. So just as we saw with Christian, the wicket gate, this rounded gate, is the sort of first benchmark on the King's Highway, the narrow path, which is the route from the city of destruction to the celestial city. So just like Christian, Christiana and her family have to pass through it as well. They knock on the door, and the gatekeeper, Goodwill, who you see here in the dark suit, immediately lets Christiana and her family through the gate. But for whatever reason, Mercy is left outside the gate, and she's extremely distressed by this. She's afraid that she's not going to be able to go on the journey, to be on the path, to be with Christiana and her family. She's so distressed that she faints. Goodwill comes to her, he revives her, he tells her not to be afraid, he tells her to knock again, and then ultimately she is let through the gate and is allowed to join Christiana and her family. This may be some sort of message about the importance of a Christian upbringing. Since Mercy was not part of the family to begin with and only joined their party later on, she didn't have the same upbringing, the same values as Christiana and her family did. So this may indicate that there's an extra hoop, for instance, to jump through for someone who hasn't been part of this culture from the very beginning. At any rate, they, at this point, continue on their journey together. So once Christiana and Mercy and Christiana's 4 sons pass through the wicket gate, they are immediately assigned a guide for their journey, and that guide's name is Greatheart, and he's the guy that you see here with this kind of Roman legionnaire's helmet on. Christian before them had not had a guide, but remember this was written in the 17th century where it was unthinkable for a woman and children to be roaming around the countryside by themselves. So the presence of Greatheart is a necessary thing in Christiana's part of the story. And in fact, it is a good thing for them because there are all kinds of dangers that present themselves to these women and children, just as they have for Christian before them. As they approach the gates of the Palace Beautiful, they face the same lions that Christian had faced when he was approaching the palace, so Greatheart is a help in navigating that situation. But the other thing that happens to them is that just as they approach the gates of the Palace Beautiful, a giant named Grim approaches them and threatens them terribly. Greatheart pulls out his sword, gives the giant a severe thrust, cuts off his arm, knocks his helmet off, and the women and children are so grateful that the giant has been vanquished. You can see them on their knees, thanking the Lord and thanking Greatheart for his valiant efforts on their behalf. And at this point, they can enter in the Palace Beautiful, where they get shelter for the night. So Christiana and her family are welcomed into the Palace Beautiful by the sisters who live there, and they're given lodging for the night, and they, after an exhausting day, all go to bed. In the night, Mercy has a dream. And in the morning, she tells this dream to Christiana. And Mercy's dream, which you see here depicted in a scene that is informed by a very famous painting by Daniel Huntington, first painted in 1841, really encapsulates the entire story of the Pilgrim's Progress in and of itself. If you remember, the book of the Pilgrim's Progress is told in the form of a dream that the author, John Bunyan, had. So by having one of his characters, Mercy, also have a dream, she gets to convey in this useful, understandable little nugget what the whole message of the book is about. In Mercy's dream, she's sitting alone in a solitary place, as she describes it, and she is bemoaning the hardness of her heart. Others come up to her and start to jostle her and make fun of her and deride her for her faith. And as she's sitting there in despair, this celestial visitor comes to her and tells her not to be afraid, gives her a crown to wear, and leads her up a golden stairway where there is an angelic figure waiting for her who says to her, "Welcome, daughter." So again, it's just that idea of being in a difficult situation, making your way through with some help to reach your final reward in the end. So as Christiana and her party continue on their journey, they face many of the same challenges that Christian had faced before them. And of course, the most severe challenge is the journey through the valley of the shadow of death. The narrow path goes right through it. There's no avoiding it. They've got to do it. And it is a harrowing experience for them, just as it was for Christian. But somewhat less harrowing, because they do have Greatheart there to protect them, and you can see his figure standing over them, protecting them in a gesture that's very reminiscent of the Renaissance motif of the Virgin of Mercy, an all-encompassing figure gathering other figures together with her to protect them. Mercy and Greatheart both sort of take that role in this scene from the moving panorama of Pilgrim's Progress. The other thing that they have in their favor is that it's daylight. So whereas Christian had been compelled to travel through the valley of the shadow of death in the dark, they have daylight, they have Greatheart, and they get through it somewhat less eventfully than Christian had before them. So after they leave the valley of the shadow of death, again, there are many more challenges, just like Christian had had, but eventually they find their way to the land of Beulah, which, if you remember, is sort of that last stop before you get to the celestial city. Here they have a very extended period of rest. They're here in the land of Beulah much longer than Christian had been. They grow older, the children get married, they have their own families, they live whole lives here in the land of Beulah. As they live here, messengers are periodically coming across the river of death, which you see here in the foreground, sending a message to someone there that they should cross the river of death and go to the celestial city. And eventually the time comes when a celestial messenger comes and tells Christiana that it is her time and that she has to report to the gates of the celestial city within 5 days. And as we continue on, you'll see that whole process that Christiana goes through when she crosses the river. So Christiana wades into the river of death, clothed in the white gown of immortality, as John Bunyan describes it. This scene is very reminiscent as well of Renaissance motifs, including the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption of the Virgin, very much informed by that artistic tradition. Now, what's happening here, metaphorically and literally, is that Christiana is dying. She is the oldest in the party, so it makes sense that she is the first to be called across the river of death. It's a joyful thing because she gets to enter the celestial city, but it's also a sad thing because she's being separated from her family. And that is effectively rendered in this panorama scene. You can see her family over there on the left side of the scene, and they are grieving and crying and sorry to see her go.
But over here on the right side, you can see Greatheart playing his cymbals for joy, and our old friend Evangelist from part 1 of the Pilgrim's Progress, who is playing the harp for joy. They are thrilled and delighted that Christiana has completed her journey and that she's about to meet her reward. So if you remember in part 1 of the Panorama of Pilgrim's Progress, at the end of Christian's journey, we just leave him waiting in the river of death, and there's a hint that he is going to be escorted into the celestial city, but we never do see it. So it's at the end of part 2 that the viewers finally get their visual reward in this glorious scene of Christiana on the other side of the river of death, being escorted by these 2 angels into the celestial city. Now, true of the book itself, you get to know that Christiana gets to the celestial city. You get to see those gates open, but you never get to go inside. Bunyan never lets his readers inside the gates of those celestial city, and the painters of the Panorama never let you visually see what the inside of that celestial city is. And the message there is that you've got to take your own journey. You can get a sense of what it's like while you're here in this world, but you can never actually see it. And that's effectively conveyed in the scene from the Panorama, where you see this sort of golden halo of the celestial city just out of your range of vision up there in the upper right corner. All of the motion of this scene is headed towards that. That's what this has all been about, is reaching that destination, but you still don't get to see it. And so when you're done with the book, when you're done with the Panorama performance, you still have this longing to undertake the journey yourself so that you can see the glories that await you.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through the moving panorama of Pilgrim's Progress, a rare and remarkable work of art in the collection of the Saco Museum in Saco, Maine. 8 feet high and 800 feet long, this panorama was created in mid-19th century America. It was thought lost for almost 100 years until it was rediscovered in the Saco Museum's vault. We're standing here today because through the generosity of many donors, the Saco Museum received funds to restore the panorama, to create all kinds of interpretive tools, and to make it accessible for future scholars. My name is Jessica Routhier, and for 4 years I was the director of the Saco Museum, and it was my very great privilege to work on restoring this magnificent work of American art.